Mr. Peter Collier is an author and historian. He earned his BA and MA at the University of California, Berkeley. Former editor of the New Left magazine, Ramparts, he has taught at UC Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, and Miles College. Mr. Collier is the founding editor of Encounter Books, where he currently serves as a consultant. He is the author of several books about famous American families, the Rockefellers, the Kennedys, the Fords, and the Roosevelts. And also, he is the author of Medal of Honor, Portraits of Valor Beyond the Call of Duty, which profiled living Medal of Honor recipients. He is the co-author with David Horowitz of Destructive Generation, Second Thoughts About the Sixties. So without further ado, let's give a warm Hillsdale welcome to Mr. Peter Collier.
Well, I appreciate Hillsdale having me. I was here once before and had a great time. I hope you'll have a great time. I've been given license by the organizers of this event to use my personal experiences in the remarks that follow. I hope they won't regret it. Actually, it makes sense. There isn't a really strong consensus about the meanings of the 60s. It's an era that's best seen through a kaleidoscope, really, than through a single lens. Personal was political. Don't forget that part. Let's begin with June 1962, since we're talking about the New Left. My assignment in this wonderful college is to talk about the New Left in Vietnam. June 62, that's when a small group of college students who were members of a newly formed organization called Students for Democratic Society, an organization whose rise and fall would define, really, the New Left. They spent a few intense days at retreat in Michigan and came up with a manifesto they called the Port Huron Manifesto, the Port Huron Statement. It was a really audacious birth announcement for a movement that had big plans for itself from the beginning and big plans for our country. I should note at the beginning here that I considered myself part of the New Left, and note too, feeling part of it was easy because it was always really a tendency rather than an organization per se, different from the old left in that regard. The communist left. No party cards. You didn't have to accept certain dogma to be a new leftist. You just had to see the world in a certain way. I wasn't at Port Huron in 1962, but I remember feeling strongly that the document that SDS drew up there, with my sometime friend Tom Hayden playing a major role, spoke for me. I liked the zesty impertinence of it. I liked the audacious premise that our generation shouldn't have to wait for its middle years, as generations typically do, to make a serious bid for power. One element of the New Left was represented by the red diaper babies coming out of the communist ghettos, where their parents, ghettos of the mind really, where their parents had retreated in the 1930s. These red diaper babies were comparatively ideologically sophisticated. They were conversant with Marx and especially Trotsky, although they rejected the Communist Party for being really too stodgy and conservative, as well as too Stalinist. They gave the New Left a facsimile of intellectual rigor. The other element of the New Left was comprised of restless young people like Hayden and myself, whose ideology was really basically only a suspicion that America had given everything in the world to us except meaning. We picked up on the whiff of subversiveness that was abroad in America in the late 50s and was exemplified most explicitly by the Beat generation, obviously. We were driven by a homemade existentialism that was still wet behind the ears, and we believed we would find ourselves in action. The film scene that spoke most directly to us of all the movies of the late 50s is the famous one you probably remember, in The Wild One, where Marlon Brando plays the head of a motorcycle gang, terrifying a small community in California. It was actually Hollister, California. And somebody comes up and says, "What is it you people want?" He looks at them with that heavy-lidded menace that he, was perfect at and says, "I don't know, what do you got?" That was us. The yearnings of these two strains of the New Left the yearnings they shared could be heard most clearly in the opening paragraph of the 1962 Port Huron Statement. We are a people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably at the world we inherit. It's no accident the words uncomfortably and comfort appear in this key sentence. We were uncomfortable with what we regarded as the moral deficits of our parents' world and the bad deals that we thought they'd made to achieve security and prosperity. We also questioned what we saw as the false comfort of the materialism which they, having lived through the Depression and through war, sought to use as a breakwater against the hazards of history. At its onset, the New Left rejected the complacency and apathy. These are words that occur more than once in the Port Huron Statement, that we saw in our elders' lives. We were concerned about alienation, authoritarianism, instead of the class struggle, which was the raison d'etre of the old left. We saw ourselves as a prophetic minority and believed, at least in the beginning, that our generational task was making America live up to its ideals. We would do this by promoting what the Port Huron Statement called participatory democracy, one of the key words of the 60s, which would mobilize those who were left out and beaten down in our country and give them a say in the quality and direction of their lives. This 27,000-word document, Port Huron Statement, included lengthy and somewhat abstruse and perhaps simplistic mini manifestos on subjects such as values, social malaise, and university reform. But its immediate targets were racial injustice and the possibility of nuclear war. We might deliberately ignore or avoid or fail to feel other human problems, this statement said, but not these two. They demand that we as individuals take responsibility for encounter and resolution. So in the first few years after the Port Huron Statement, New Leftists focused really on the problem of race, insisting that it be treated as an urgent national crisis, moral crisis. Racial equity, the right to advocate for it, was at the heart, for instance, of the Berkeley free speech movement of 1964, which is really a quintessential New Left event. In fact, many leftists became freedom riders, civil rights workers in the early 60s who went in the lion's den of the South, often at great personal jeopardy, and I think they had an impact. But their other concern, the Cold War and its discontents, was more problematic. The New Left's pledge was to be neither red, as the old left had been, nor quite red, white, and blue, as our elders expected us to be. We rejected communism and capitalism more or less equally as outworn creeds and saw the US and USSR more or less as equally threatening to the future. We would not be blinded by patriotism as our parents' generation had been. This close to moral equivalence was at the heart of the New Left's newness, really. In retrospect, it can also be seen as a genetic defect that helped make it too easy, far too easy, during the Vietnam War for the New Left to reject America altogether. Vietnam was fully on the New Left's radar by the summer of '63, when the first Buddhist monks began to burn themselves, and later on when the Diem regime was decapitated in a bloody coup. The civil rights movement was still the focus of the New Left's attention at that time, but as the U.S. sent more troops into Vietnam early in 1965, finally abandoning the fiction that they were merely advisors, we became focused on what was happening there. SDS saw racial injustice at home and the war abroad as evil Siamese twins, and initially tried to use the tools of the civil rights movement, demonstrations, civil disobedience, public information campaigns, to combat the war. It held teach-ins. They were, very influential teach-ins, a series of teach-ins in the spring of 1965 at leading campuses around the country. I remember the one at Berkeley was quite amazing. It had everybody, including Norman Mailer, who I actually wound up in the men's restroom with inadvertently, not on purpose. And I'm kind of standing there next to him at the urinal, and I'm kind of, God, Nora Mailer. And I look over, and he said in one of the great comments anybody's ever said to me, he says, "Don't worry, we're all peers here." Get it? So it held teach-ins on these campuses during the spring of '65, and it began to counsel for how to avoid the draft. The SDS actually organized a march on Washington, on the White House in the spring, that drew what seemed to be, at that point, an astounding 25,000 people. "We dream for Vietnam a vision of a society in which all can control their destinies," SDS wrote after this march, with an upbeat and perhaps naive rhetoric that seemed almost obsolete the moment it appeared. By 1966, the New Left was being gathered up into a larger, more amorphous ecumenical thing called the movement that was always shape-shifting, always on the move, very much branded by the sometimes hallucinatory delusions of grandeur that characterized the 60s. New leftists were the movement's driving force and brainstem. But there were many other fellow travelers, church groups, clergymen, other people looking for nirvana, earnest young couples pushing babies in strollers at peace marches that soon were taking place almost weekly, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Black Power movement, hippies living in a haze of bliss and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. There were some good times in the 60s. And yippies, led by Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman, Groucho Marxists, we called them, who created the movement's radical performance art, invading the balcony of the stock market and raining down dollar bills on the traders below, showing up at the Pentagon and chanting in the hopes of levitating the building and exorcising the evil within. When the Detroit and Newark ghettos became battlegrounds between rioters and police and National Guards in mid-1967, the movement saw the face of war, the war in Vietnam, in this war at home. Two manifestations of one evil, the system. At the beginning, and the beginning then, at that moment, of the oceanic feeling so much a part of the 60s that all the evils we saw around us were connected by some sinister synchronicity. I'm going to take a Mario Rubio moment here and have a little bit of water. The New Left had an impact on the nature of the early debate about Vietnam, absolutely insisting that it was wrong because it was immoral, not because it was against our national interests. I remember violent arguments with advocates of the famous political scientist of the day, Hans Morgenthau's position. This is a bad war because it was not a war that could help our country. It was against our national interests. The New Left wouldn't buy that. It had to be a moral argument. But nobody was paying attention to our arguments, and this surprised and most of all enraged us. The commitment to participatory democracy is so crucial at the New Left's founding began to fall away. Democracy was, after all, now fighting the most undemocratic of wars. And in any case, according to Herbert Marcuse, who became one of the mentors of the New Left at about this time, democracy was based on repressive tolerance, which made it totalitarianism in disguise. The belief in the promise of America, which stood behind the Port Huron statement, was also wavering. America now seemed to be, to many of us, what the novelist Henry Miller had called it, an air-conditioned nightmare. The targets of the New Left stepped up arguments and actions against the war, and this is important, were never conservatives or even Republicans. They were irrelevant. We zeroed in on the centrist liberals of the Democratic Party, those who were compassionate on social policy, but tough anti-communists and cold warriors, people David Halberstam later called in his book about the origins of the war in Vietnam, the best and the brightest. They were the architects of America's rise to preeminence in the post-war world and its entry into Vietnam. We aimed an absolutely withering attack at them in the magazine I edited, Ramparts, which was really arguably the most, influential magazine of the era, small circulation, at its peak maybe 450,000, but modeled itself on Time magazine, saw itself as a four-color, glossy, New Left publication channeling our ideas into the mainstream. So we aimed a withering attack at them, and it was repeated elsewhere. One of the kill shots was a 1967 essay by Noam Chomsky, then known only as a linguistics scholar, called The Responsibility of Intellectuals. This is one of the most significant and unappreciated stories of the era, the New Left's success in taking down an intellectual and policy elite that seemed unassailable when the 60s began. By the end of the decade, this elite was absolutely out of business. Many of these centrist liberals had recanted, adopting the talking points of the New Left as they turned their backs on their guilty former selves. Some of them would, in fact, lead the purge of the remaining centrist liberals from the Democratic Party in 1972, help it to brazenly seize the name liberal for itself when it had in fact destroyed what until then had epitomized the word liberal, and then, under George McGovern, make the Democratic Party into a receptacle for New Left thinking about Vietnam and about America. Gene Kirkpatrick and the other centrists forced out of this new Democratic Party would wander in a political wilderness until the candidacy of Ronald Reagan, when they were finally given an opportunity to finish the task they had been forced to abandon, which was driving a stake through the heart of the Soviet Union. More than 100,000 people came to the Fall '67 march in Washington, staged by the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, which we familiarly called the Mobe. The event was the subject of Norman Mailer's Armies of the Night, and it generated a lot of attention. But less noticed, but perhaps more significant, was an event that occurred earlier that week at the University of Wisconsin, when a demonstration there became one of the very first to turn violent, causing 19 police and some 50 demonstrators to be hospitalized. This was a very large straw in the wind. New leftists were merciless critics of what we regarded as the administration's lies about Vietnam, that it was being fought to prevent dominoes from falling, that it was that the ultimate enemy was the international communist conspiracy, and the biggest lie of all, that we were winning or could win. These lies were clear long before the Pentagon Papers substantiated them. We thought the evils of these lies were so great that we had a right to create our own lies, penny ante in comparison, of course, to combat them, that the National Liberation Front, Viet Cong, was an indigenous, autonomous force of the South and not controlled by Hanoi. It was an article of faith, absolute article of faith for the anti-war movement. That the people we were fighting were peasant nationalists who actually believed in something like the participatory democracy we had advocated before we lost faith in it. And that Ho Chi Minh, in particular, who had lived in the U.S. briefly in 1917 and was said to admire our history, could have been a friend if only we had let them. That last lie was particularly tenacious, almost comically so. It involved, dredging up the fact that he had worked in the Boston hotel, I can't remember the name of it, that had created the Boston cream pie. And in fact, he had, in his early days working there, been one of the pastry chefs that helped create the Boston cream pie. Ramparts, the radical magazine where I worked, went so far as to put Uncle Ho on one of its covers, portraying him dressed in Revolutionary War drag, crossing the Mekong River with his cadre in a sampan, in a wicked pun on Washington crossing the Delaware. Ho was something of a fabulist, as we all know, who had estimated some 200 aliases during his mysterious lifetime. He was many things to many people, but he's one thing for sure, a Leninist. He had advocated for Bolshevism in Asia when he lived in Paris in 1919, helped form the French Communist Party the following year, was an early member of Lenin's Comintern. And he murdered a lot of people in his land reform schemes, one of the quintessential parts of the repertoire of communist leaders when he first came to power. Dostoevsky once said that, famously, that if God is dead, all things are permitted. Something like that was true for the New Left and democracy. If democracy turned out to be a sham, just a high-sounding justification for genocide, as we began to claim when the brutality of the war mounted, then all things were permitted us in trying to end it. Opposing the war justified mythologizing the Black Panther Party, a gang of thugs who rose out of the Oakland ghetto, and hiding their weapons in our white middle-class garages so they could have access to them to help prosecute their war against the cops. Opposing the war justified sending our New Left representatives to Bratislava and Havana and Budapest and Hanoi, most of all, to meet with the North Vietnamese and plan joint strategy. It justified fighting with the cops in demonstrations. It justified spitting on U.S. troops when they arrived back home. I actually saw that. People claim, oh, that's a myth. I saw it several times at the San Francisco airport, even though they were no less victims of the war than the peasant soldiers they killed and were killed by. Although I didn't voice the opinion of the time, being too much of a coward, even I thought there was something deeply wrong with white privileged college kids whose wealthy families bought them deferments, screaming baby killers at 19-year-old working-class high school dropouts who'd been the first ones drafted. Opposing the war justified trying to burn down the universities, which the New Left saw as guilty collaborating with the military-industrial complex. It justified revising U.S. history into a tale of bloodlust and oppression that began with the Puritans and it continued ever after without reserve. It justified an assault against bourgeois individualism, as we called it, anchored in the family and anchored by the family. I remember attending a wedding of two of my Berkeley comrades during the late 60s, a sort of real but parody wedding. The cake was topped with the words, "Smash monogamy." And indeed, this marriage, like so many other relationships, became a soap opera disaster of serial betrayals, leaving behind a couple of children who later wandered around Berkeley for the next few years looking like air crash survivors. By the end of 1967, Vietnam was now in the marrow of the movement. We thought about the Vietnamese when we woke up. We thought about them when we went home. We thought about them when we went to bed. We talked about the Vietnamese like they were a particularly earnest and deserving family that lived somewhere in the lower part of our blocks. We displayed Hanoi's flags on our windows. We were stoned on the morality of the Vietnamese and of ourselves. I remember once riding in a car with two of my comrades on the way home from what we then called street action. "This war is actually driving us crazy," one of them said, not unhappily. The other one smiled and lazily raised a clenched fist and said, "Right on." 1968, of course, was a year when everything came together and came apart. It was a year of Tet, that military catastrophe that left some 50,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters dead and didn't produce anything resembling the national revolution Hanoi had banked on, but was seen as a success nonetheless because Walter Cronkite said it was so. It was the year U.S. troop commitment reached a high point of over 530,000, and the year when a majority of Americans first told pollsters they thought the war was wrong, or at least unwinnable. The year of assassinations, the year of Nixon's election, and most of all for the movement, it was the year of the Democratic Convention in Chicago, where we staged a bloody riot, our Kristallnacht, while chanting to the TV cameras, "The whole world is watching." That moment and that slogan captured the movement's swaggering belief at the time that it, as much as nations and armies, was an author of history. For nearly 5 years, the New Left had marched to the slogan of "Bring the troops home." After 1968, that slogan morphed gradually into "Bring the war home." Now America began to be spelled with 3 Ks, not a very subtle reference to the Ku Klux Klan. I remember once being in the living room of a Berkeley commune about this time when cheers erupted as Walter Cronkite announced the number of U.S. soldiers killed that week, as he always did on Friday afternoons. The brutality of this war encouraged us to brutalize ourselves. Marx was suddenly in favor among the new leftists who had initially scorned him, and there was a new fad for Maoism, notwithstanding the fact that the great helmsman had already killed 40 million of his own during the Great Leap Forward and would take out another 10 million or so in this Cultural Revolution just then beginning. More significantly, Frantz Fanon's theory of revolutionary violence, he wrote a book that was huge for a moment in 1969 called Wretched of the Earth. This theory of revolutionary violence was now suddenly de rigueur. It may seem incomprehensible looking back at it today, but Newsweek made a possible revolution in the United States into a cover story in 1969. We were similarly deluded. We believed in the words of the Jim Morrison song that became a sort of anthem for the movement, that it was time to break on through to the other side. It was in 1969 also, there was an uprising in Berkeley over rights to a strip of land the university owned, and this riot became known as the People's Park demonstrations. It was a huge moment in the history of the revolution that we thought was about to be born. At its height, at the height of this fierce confrontation between law enforcement and demonstrators, there was a meeting of the Politburo, if you will, of the street action, led again by Tom Hayden, who was a sort of everyman of the movement. Our aim, he said, should be to follow the example of Viet Cong and establish liberated zones, first in Berkeley, then in Ann Arbor, then in Madison, then in Cambridge, and hook them up into a rough draft of revolutionary America. The Black Panthers, who were already locked and loaded, would be our vanguard in the battles ahead, our Americong, as Hayden put it. He asked David Hilliard, then the Panthers' Minister of Defense, to shoot down one of the police helicopters dropping pepper spray on the People's Park rioters. Hilliard shot him in one of the great moments of the 60s, shot him a contemptuous look, that just a withering look, and he said, "Just like you, Tom, get a nigger to pull the trigger." More significantly, 1969 was also the year that Students for a Democratic Society, one of whose brightest stars Hayden had been at the beginning, finally flamed out in an ugly factional fight in its final national convention that left the group that became known as Weatherman and then the Weather Underground in charge of the tattered remnants of the organization. Then, after issuing a manifesto that said their intention was to fight U.S. imperialism and create a classless world of communism, thus turning the new left back into the old left, Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers and all the others went to Havana for instructions and came back to the U.S. amped up to begin their bombing campaign. "We're going to shove this war down their dumb fascist throats," one weatherman said at that point. "We're going to kick ass." What SDS had been in its beginnings, an organization seeking to make America live up to its promise, and what it had become late in 1969, a brain-dead cult of violence, actually issuing a formal declaration of war on America. This will always be, for me, the story and minuscule of the 60s. In the 1980s particularly, when what remained of the movement, let's call it the leftover left, tried to stage a second coming in order to defeat the Reagan administration's efforts to block communism in Central America, there was a renaissance of interest in the 60s. But then, as now, the nihilistic extremism that appeared at the end of the era was airbrushed out of the picture by the left's apologists. If there were excesses, oh well, these were understandable given the provocation of the war. But if there were excesses, they were few and far between. The anti-war movement was basically comprised of idealists who wanted nothing more than to give peace a chance. There were indeed such people. Far more of them than there were of the hardcore leftists. But at the ground level and in real time, It seemed that the radicals called the tune and they did the dance. How real were the attractions of radical chic? Well, I got an insight early in 1970 when, after a couple of weeks after I had written a story in Ramparts about the Indian Alcatraz, Indian occupation of Alcatraz, excuse me, I got a call from one of Jane Fonda's camp followers. This person was in Europe and said that Jane had left her French director husband, Roger Vadim, and was doing meditation in India with the Maharishi yogi. But after years as a film debutante and sex kitten, she wanted to come home and get some authenticity into her life. Would I help bring her into the movement, and would I take her to Alcatraz? Much to my wife's dismay, I of course said yes. Not realizing I was about ready to give this vain and vacuous woman who subtracts from the sum total of human knowledge every time she opens her mouth a cause and an identity. I met her on a San Francisco pier one morning, and a private yacht took us to Alcatraz. She was in her shag-cut klute phase, very earnest, very much the quick study. When we got to the old prison, she saw immediately that there was a power struggle between the hardline Sioux and the other tribes for control of the island, and immediately went off to smoke dope with the Sioux warriors, as they called themselves, in their part of the compound. Soon after, she was off on her magic mystery tour of the movement, to the Panthers, to the GI coffeehouse movement, and ultimately, of course, to Hanoi itself. Sometimes she muffed her lines, as in the appearance one night on the Dick Cavett show, when she committed the classic spoonerism in saying that the war there in Southeast Asia was being fought by the U.S. to control the tongue and tinston of the area. Tin and tungsten, you get it? If you get it, shake your head. But she quickly learned to walk the walk and talk the talk, and frankly, nobody did it better. Vietnam gave Fonda her most memorable still shot atop that anti-aircraft gun aiming at U.S. flyers. It gave her her most memorable comment, which was her most memorable line, which is when she said that these POWs were probably war criminals, and they were lucky they weren't being prosecuted, just simply being held and beaten half to death. And it gave her most enduring role, the one she'll always be remembered for after the other ones have faded into celluloid dust. Hanoi Jane. In the end, when the last U.S. helicopter left Saigon with all those terrified people desperately clinging to its skids, we got pretty much everything we wanted. The North now controlled the South. The U.S. was not only defeated but humiliated, beginning a retreat that would enable the USSR to launch an international offensive for communism over the next few years. But was Southeast Asia the heaven on earth we believed it would be when Hanoi finally won? Au contraire. It was a hell of tiger cages and political re-education camps and summary executions. Boat people, killing fields of Cambodia. As Richard Nixon memorably said, more people killed in the first 3 years of the communist peace than in all 13 years of the anti-communist war. Some of us, with Joan Baez, of all people, playing a leading role, tried to make the horrors visited on what had been South Vietnam a matter of discussion in the movement, a fraternal matter of discussion, not a matter of acrimony or a split, but just that it should be on the radar. We should, let's encounter this a little bit. The response we got was the old communist slapdown. There aren't any enemies on the left. We were told to shut up, in effect, and begin trudging toward the next utopia in the Horn of Africa, Central America, wherever. Although it would take years for me fully to accomplish this, this is when I myself began to leave the left. The war in Vietnam was desperately wrong in the way it was justified, the way it was fought, and the American lives that it chewed up, and the indiscriminate carnage it caused among the people of Southeast Asia. It really was a heart of darkness. and it taught daunting lessons about our nation. But it taught lessons about the self as well. For me, the summary judgment came on all those years, came one night at Elaine's, which was then the fashionable Manhattan watering spot for the literary industrial complex, I guess. Some of us had gathered there just as the 60s was going on 70s. And Willie Morris, a name that's kind of now forgotten but was important at the time. He was the editor of Harper's Magazine, major literary figure of the day, no particular friend of the war. He was there also. I saw him, he was at the bar, he was watching us for a while, looking at us, obviously in his cups. He kind of lurched over to our table and looked down at us and said in his Mississippi drawl, "You know the problem with y'all? The problem with y'all is that you didn't love America enough." And then he walked back to the bar. He was right. I see my old comrades now and then, the handful who still talk to me. They too are shuffling through their golden years. But one thing still burns bright for them, despite the night that approaches. And that is the good old days when we were all so bad. They take comfort in the belief that the movement's ideas, not the ideas of the New Left at Port Huron, but of the later, more exciting, more Rococo phase, have by some perverse twist of fate not only survived, but triumphed. They see this victory in the universities. Hillsdale, mirabile dictu is an exception, where the radicals, after their long march through the 70s and 80s, now control things and have made into a citadel for snowflakes and safe places, for grievance groups and indoctrination sessions, including the attacks du jour on whiteness. You probably have seen those. Whiteness is now, they're giving courses in whiteness, unlike the courses in all the other minority groups, which are affirmation courses. The courses in whiteness are attack courses. These courses on whiteness eerily echo the Weatherman attacks 50 years ago on what they call white skin privilege, attacks that permeated the movement. And why shouldn't they echo Weatherman? Former Weather Underground leaders Bill Ayers and Bernadine Doran, after all, who surfaced from their bombing campaign after a few years with scarcely a slap on the wrist, and certainly with no remorse whatsoever. Bill Ayers, once told me for a story I was writing, he said, really about the time he came up, he said, looked at me and said, guilty as hell, free as a bird, America's a great country. The guy does irony pretty well. Came up after a few years with scarcely a slap on the wrist and certainly with no remorse, and they were able to pick up their lives without missing a beat as influential professors in influential universities. It's one of the great travesties of all time. They should have been tried for treason. My old comrades can see a victory, too, in the media, which glorify organizations like Black Lives Matter and give credence to their line that our nation is fatally gripped by a racism that gets more homicidal every year that we become more distant from slavery, and by predatory misogyny that never rests. And most of all, they take heart in a Democratic Party, which is now an integral part of the left and filled with the same contempt for the deplorables that we ourselves had back in the day, for those middle Americans who didn't particularly like the war, but hated how we were trashing our country. So there you have it. The song of the 60s is over, but the melody lingers on. Thank you.
Mr. Collier has agreed to sign copies of his book, Destructive Generation, Second Thoughts About the 60s, directly following the lecture in Phillips Lobby. We now have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you.
Okay, my question, after all that stuff, on this, this movement that we're having right now in the United States against Trump, and now it's the rich left. What are we? Not what are we supposed to do? I know what we're supposed to do is stand up to them and tell them to go to hell. But what can we keep on doing? You know, our children, I have grandchildren, and I want them to learn what did happen. Thank God they go to the academy, they'll hear some of it. But you know, we got public school that just could care less about that part of our history and where we went wrong.
Well, I think you're right about that, actually. All these things kind of come together. Bill Ayers became a quote-unquote distinguished professor of childhood education at the University of Illinois, Urbana, one of the campuses. And I'm sorry? Chicago? Okay. I thought it was one of the outlying campuses. And he really was incredibly, has been, he's retired now, and been pretty influential, actually, in taking the ideas. I mean, the conquest of the university was a fait accompli by, in my opinion, pretty much by the 90s. The long march through the institutions, a phrase that was coined by the German new leftist Rudi Dutschke, you know, that is, we've lost now for the time being, you know, when the Vietnam War is over and the kind of the air went out of this thing, this revolution, we've lost. But what we need to do is begin a long march through the institutions. And the institutions that were most available were the universities, which we had tried to burn down, of course, in the 60s, and we went back to get on the tenure track in the 70s and 80s. And so it seemed to me pretty much by the 90s, I taught at Berkeley, actually, in the late 70s, early 80s for a while. And I could see the change kind of coming over it, and it seemed like perhaps a lost cause. And the new left, or the left theorists exemplified by Ayers, pretty much felt so as well. So they began to attack really K-12 education. And that's where all the firepower is right now. You don't have to worry about taking, you have hegemony in the universities. Let's move on. K-12 is where it's at. That's where he's imported the hostile Marxist ideas of some Brazilian theorist named Paulo Freire. And, he wrote these textbooks influencing not only in-classroom type education, but most of all, the education of teachers, that is teacher training, very smart, very new left. And that's where the attack is now. I mean, it's on K-12 education. And I think it's absolutely, it's a hidden offensive, hidden intellectual and political offensive that is now, if you want to chill yourself, start Googling, indoctrination in K-12 education. I mean, it's pretty amazing. I mean, I don't know, textbooks, teacher training, and the teaching profession has become much more vulnerable to these ideas now. It is no longer a sort of moderate profession. It's been infiltrated over the years by people who have a mission. I have kind of a personal thing, and kind of a silly story, but I have a 5-year-old who's in a pretty exclusive private school in Hollywood. And I asked him what they did for Christmas. And he said, well, we learned songs about Kwanzaa. And I said, Kwanzaa? There's one black kid out of the whole school. School costs $17,000 a year or something. My son is a madman. And Kwanzaa, I got hysterical, and I wrote a letter that my son wouldn't let me mail to them, pointing out Kwanzaa is a bogus, idiotic concept that was begun by a black radical named Ron Karenga, Mulana Ron Karenga, in 1966. It was created out of whole cloth. This guy did 6 years in jail for torturing 2 women, and he became the godfather of this movement created out of whole cloth called Kwanzaa. And I'm thinking, if this exclusive school in Hollywood, California, is telling these kids to, you can imagine where it is. I mean, the black people, I think, African Americans, are too smart for this stuff. Only white people are stupid enough for this stuff, something like, I think, something like just a minuscule number, less than 5% of black people celebrate Kwanzaa. That's what I read. Perhaps I'm wrong about that, but it makes sense. African Americans are Christians, you know.
Did the school write you back?
Say it again?
Did the school respond?
This story gets worse and worse. My son is so cowardly that he wouldn't let me send the letter. So, because he was afraid there would be, reprisals against my 5-year-old grandson. Don't get me started, as my mother used to say. Another question?
Yeah, I was there. I saw Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison, any number of Grateful Dead concerts. Isn't it Winston Churchill that said when you're young, you're a liberal, and when you get older, you're a conservative? I think, anyway, clearly that's happened to you, and I wonder if that hasn't happened to the people in Berkeley, although they haven't realized it, to stop Coulter and Yiannopoulos from speaking at Freedom of Speech Square on the campus. I don't have a question exactly, except that you taught there, and how it is that they can feel that they're not misunderstanding the idea and committing the same sins themselves.
Since we're dealing with senectitude here inadvertently, I have to admit that my hearing is not. Can you summarize for you holding the microphone?
The question is that in Berkeley, when you come at the end of Telegraph Square, there's the big open area in the campus, and there's the freedom of speech area with the little platform that you can get up and talk on. But what used to be, if you looked up in the dictionary, liberal aren't really anymore, and they would told Coulter to leave and Yiannopoulos not to show up, and we're burning buildings to stop free speech in the very place where supposedly it was founded. And it's so absurd, but I don't really have a question exactly, except to maybe have you comment about how that is reflecting in the way the country is going.
The free speech movement kind of lasted for about a year. And, if you want to see a place where free speech is ruthlessly repressed, you should go to Berkeley these days. I mean, there's probably the most malicious organization on campus in America called the Students for Justice in Palestine. Ho, ho. They're, controlled the public dialogue there about the Middle East, ruthlessly anti-Semitic, and, it's a tough place to go against them. They have faculty members, one of their faculty members is a guy named Hatem Bejin, aptly named Hatem Bejin, who actually founded the Students for Justice in Palestine. And, he's actually made Berkeley into a place where, the Nakba, which is the alleged catastrophe, which was actually the founding of Israel, the alleged catastrophe for the Palestinian people, where that's the big, kind of anti-Jewish hate fest every year. It's not a friendly place to free speech anywhere on campus today, in my opinion. In fact, it's not only that there's kind of sanctions against the people who speak incorrect thoughts. It's the idea. I mean, even the idea of free speech itself is being challenged as a virtue, and that goes back. I mentioned Herbert Marcuse. This whole idea he had of repressive tolerance. He really actually laid out the ground rules for how you attack free speech. Free speech is actually counterproductive and certainly counter-revolutionary when it advances, bad ideas. So it must be ruthlessly repressed. Therefore, you have things like you have, basically the special forces of the left today are these anti-FA people on the streets beating the hell out of people who say incorrect things. They're stormtroopers. The left is all talking all about, Nazism and, fascism and stuff like that. Of course, these anti-fascists are the biggest fascists of all.
Please.
Right back there.
We'll do a question over here real quick, and then we'll get back to you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you for speaking, Mr. Collier. My question for you is this. Was there any one specific event that led to your departure from this new left movement, or was it a culmination of things?
Any one event that did what?
That led to your departure from this movement?
It really was this whole thing about Vietnam. Those of us who were perturbed, back in the day, there was this principle called internationalism. We were internationalists. In the interests of internationalism, it seemed to a handful of us, and again, Joan Baez has to get really tremendous credit here. She really led this. We had an obligation. These were our people in South Vietnam, even though they were seen as counter-revolutionaries. They were the Vietnamese, after all. They're getting slaughtered in political re-education camps. They're getting drowned in, the seas of South China Sea. We ought to talk about this at least and say, come on, were we off base a little bit on how we romanticized Hanoi? That was what started. But be aware that it's not a momentary thing. You don't say, hey, that's it, I'm out of the left. Being part of the left, and the reason it is such an effective movement is like being part of a church. And the sanctions against apostasy are huge. And so, what people typically do is like what David Horowitz, my friend, and I, who have moved in lockstep through life for the last 50 years, what we did was, let's dig a foundation here and retreat only to here. We're still leftists. That won't work. Here, and then it's a free slide. I was telling the wonderful speaker you're going to have in a couple of hours today that I always think of that great poem by Dylan Thomas about the death of his mother. And the refrain is, after the first death, there is no other. Now, what Thomas meant, of course, was that the first time you experience death as a person, the first time you experience it, it is so definitive that the deaths that come, will never surpass it in its impact. Well, I always thought, I've come to think that after the first doubt, there is no other. That first doubt, the seed that is planted in you, when that doubt, if you have a shred of authenticity, that doubt is going to lead to other doubts, and finally, the whole thing will collapse. One of the problems with the left is that it doesn't let those doubts ever, come in. It has a very effective immune system and prevents those doubts from happening. So this took David and me to get out of the left. It took about 7 years. And it involved all kinds of other things, like at Ramparts, we had a bookkeeper that we allowed the Black Panthers to use because they had some weird kind of offline enterprises. There was a place called the Lamppost, which was a bar down in South Berkeley, and we allowed them to kind of use her to kind of straighten out their books. They were getting audited and everything, and she actually found out that they were laundering drugs. This was a group that was a black version of Murder, Inc., basically, and they were laundering drugs and all kinds of other stuff. Anyhow, as a result, she got killed. They killed her. They murdered her. And so that was a huge, because, the left is a gang. Where did Stalin come from? He was a bank robber. He had a gang that robbed banks. The gang metaphor is pretty strong for the left. So to answer your question, it's kind of a process, I think. And so that was true with the previous generation, not to compare any of us to any of them. But the previous generation, the left of the 30s, the God that failed left, Arthur Koestler and Richard Wright and André Gide, that recanted. I mean, it's the same for them, although in comparison to them, we're dwarves standing on the shoulders of giants. Anyway, you had a question back yonder. There.
Unfortunately, we have no more time. Thank you, Mr. Collier.
Okay.